I woke up choking on air that felt colder than it should have been. My lungs seized, and the world, what little of it I could see through the fogged visor of my cryo chamber, was spinning in shades of dull red. Every muscle hurt when I tried to move. It felt like my body was being thawed out wrong, like I was still half frozen, my veins packed with ice. The lid of the chamber opened, just wide enough for me to claw my way out. I rolled onto the cold floor, arms trembling under me as I retched nothing but bile. My skin was slick with sweat, or maybe it was the condensation from the malfunctioning cryo unit. Either way, I lay there, face pressed against the floor, trying to make sense of anything. Where the hell was I? The ship's name came to me in fragments, the Red Womb, a prison transport. I was one of the unlucky ones sentenced to this scrap heap for something I didn't even do. They told me I'd be in cryo until I reached the prison colony. Years, maybe decades, but they didn't tell me anything about this. The cryopod was supposed to keep me under until we docked, but something had gone wrong. I blinked, groggy and disoriented, trying to focus. Above me, the emergency lights shone red through the misty air. The corridor outside my cryo chamber was empty, silent. Nothing moved, except for the occasional puff of steam from a vent that had long since broken down. I forced myself up onto my knees, shaking the numbness from my legs. The cryo chamber next to mine was wide open, frost coating the inside like it had been abandoned for a long time. The door to the chamber wasn't broken. It looked like someone had tried to claw their way out. Deep gouges marked the metal. Blood, old and dried, had pooled near the edges. I looked around, half expecting someone to be waiting for me, but the room was empty. Just me and the broken pods. There had to be others, though, right? Other prisoners? Or maybe the crew. Someone in charge. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. We were supposed to sleep through the whole thing, wake up planetside, serve our time, and move on. But I wasn't planetside, and I wasn't asleep. I pushed myself to my feet, shaky but standing. A door on the far side led to the main corridor. It slid open with a reluctant groan, scraping against the floor. The light outside flashed, cutting streaks through the corridor. The ship felt like it was abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect a derelict to feel. More like it had been forgotten, left to rot in some forgotten corner of space. But the power was still running, at least in some sections. The cryo chambers had been breached, mine, the others. Had it been a malfunction or sabotage? I heard a voice overhead. The ship's PA system sputtered, the words coming through distorted. Prisoner 08467 awake. I froze, my breath catching. The AI. The ship was run by an AI. I hadn't heard it in so long I'd forgotten its hollow tone. The voice continued. All prisoners are now active. Resources are limited. Commencing survival protocol. Proceed to designated sectors. I didn't understand. Survival protocol? What the hell did that mean? The AI repeated the command, more insistent this time. Proceed to designated sectors. All prisoners must comply. I turned down the hallway trying to make sense of where I was. The layout was blurry in my mind. Cryopods were supposed to be near the central hub, but the place was bigger than I remembered. As I stumbled forward, I could hear distant movements. Not machines, people. Other prisoners waking up, confused like I was. I rounded a corner and nearly tripped over someone lying on the floor. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were wild, darting from side to side, his lips cracked and dry. He looked like he'd been awake for days, though that couldn't be right. We were all supposed to wake up together. He mumbled something I couldn't understand, shivering despite the heat in the air. Then I heard it again. Prisoners, the survival protocol has begun. Limited resources will be allocated to those who prove their worth. Engage in combat. Failure to comply will result in permanent deactivation. Combat? It hit me like a hammer to the chest. The AI was serious. This wasn't some glitch in the system. It wanted us to fight. A door opened ahead, and a man staggered out. Bigger than me, broader shoulders covered in tattoos that marked him as part of some gang. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were already balled into fists. He'd heard the same message, and I could see in his expression that he didn't need any more convincing. Only one of us was making it out of here. I didn't have time to think. The second I saw him, something inside me switched on. Survival instinct. It wasn't a conscious decision. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he had already decided I was dead. I'd seen eyes like that before, back when I was free, back when things still made sense. They were the eyes of men who didn't care who they had to bury to get what they wanted. The man approached me, his fists clenched tight, veins standing out on his arms. His muscles rippled under skin slick with sweat, and his mouth curled into a smile. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears, my body refusing to move, even though my brain urged me to run, to do anything other than stand here like an idiot. Then, the voice of the AI cut through the tension like a knife. Combatants detected, arena protocol activated. A loud mechanical grinding noise echoed through the corridor, and suddenly, metal walls shot up around us, caging us. This was the arena. My pulse quickened. There was no way out now. The man across from me had figured that out too. His grin faded into something harder, more predatory. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing sweat over his brow, then jumped at me. I threw myself back, dodging the first punch. The sound of his fist slamming into the wall behind me sent a sharp pang through my chest. If that hit had landed, it would have shattered bone. I had no idea what I was doing. I wasn't a fighter. I'd protested. I'd shouted slogans in front of corporate headquarters. I'd gotten arrested for being a nuisance to the system. That was it. That's why I was here. Wrong place, wrong time. This guy, though? He was a killer. I could see it in how he moved, how precise every motion was, how he didn't waste a second. He came at me again, and I couldn't avoid it this time. His fist connected with my shoulder, and pain crashed through me. It was a punch that tore something. I stumbled back, clutching at my arm. My legs felt like they were going to give out. If I went down now, I wouldn't get back up. Engage in combat. The AI's voice droned on overhead. It had no emotion, no urgency, like this was just a routine task. Victory will result in access to resources. The man in front of me, not even winded, moved with a casual kind of confidence, like he already knew he was going to win. He circled me, cracking his knuckles, waiting for me to make a mistake. His eyes followed my every move. I had to do something. If I didn't fight back, I was dead. That much was clear. I scanned the ground, desperate for anything that could give me an edge. That's when I saw one of the hoses from the cryo chambers hanging loose, torn away during the malfunction. It was thick, coated with frost, and long enough to wrap around a man's neck. I didn't think twice. I jumped for it. The cold, flexible hose felt heavy in my hands. He must have seen what I was doing. Before I could even get the hose ready, his knee slammed into my gut. The force of it knocked the air out of my lungs, but I didn't let go. I gripped the hose tighter, doubling over, trying to protect myself from his blows. Instinct took over and I swung the hose wild. It wasn't a solid hit, but it was enough to throw him off. The hose snapped against his arm and he stumbled, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected attack. He blinked, shaking his head, his eyes narrowing in confusion. His arm twitched from the strike, and I could see the muscles tense as he adjusted his stance. He wasn't expecting me to fight back, not like this. I could see it in the way his expression darkened, the way his teeth clenched. He charged at me, faster this time. I barely had time to react, my body moving on pure survival instinct. I twisted the hose in my hands, pulling it taut, and flung it again, aiming for his face. The hose snapped across his jaw with a crack. His eyes went wide with shock, but he didn't stop. He kept coming. I swung again, this time wrapping it around his arm as he tried to punch me. I pulled hard, twisting his arm, and he let out a growl of frustration. The more I pulled, the tighter it got. He was bigger and stronger, yanking the hose from my grip with one violent pull before slamming his fist into the side of my head. I staggered back, tasting blood in my mouth. He didn't give me a chance to recover. His fists were flying, each hit a hammer to my ribs, my face. My legs gave out and I collapsed to the floor. Every breath was a struggle, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. He stood over me, grabbing my collar and hauling me up like I weighed nothing. "Finish the fight," the AI's voice echoed calmly, like it wasn't watching me die. His fist pulled back, ready to finish me. But something in me snapped. Not physically, but mentally. This was survival. Either he died or I did. There was no middle ground. My hands shot up, grabbing his wrist with both hands. I twisted hard, and I felt something give. He stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden move, and I didn't waste the chance. I kicked out, catching him in the knee. He grunted, his leg buckling under the force, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. While he was off balance, I grabbed the hose again. It was slick with both our sweat and blood, but I didn't care. I wrapped it around his throat, pulling it tight, my muscles straining with everything I had left. He thrashed, trying to rip it away, but I held on, gritting my teeth, pulling tighter. His hands clawed at the hose, his face turning red, veins bulging in his neck. I kept pulling. His gasps for air became desperate, panicked, and for a moment, I thought he'd break free. But then his thrashing slowed, his movements weaker and more erratic. I didn't stop. The only thing running through my mind was that if I let go, I was dead. So I pulled harder using all my weight, feeling his body go slack as the fight drained out of him. By the time I let go, he was already gone. I stumbled back, the hose slipping from my hands. My legs felt like they were about to give out, and my chest burned with every breath. I collapsed against the metal cage wall, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what I'd just done. His body lay still, eyes open, staring at nothing. The AI's voice returned. "Combatant 08467 victorious. Proceed to the dormitory sector for resource allocation." I stared at the body for what felt like forever. I'd killed him. I didn't even know his name. All I knew was that I'd done what I had to, and that's all that mattered now. The walls that had caged us slid back down into the floor, leaving me alone in the corridor. I wiped the blood from my face, the sting sharp where his fists had landed. My shoulder throbbed, my head pounded, but I was still breathing. I didn't know what kind of person that made me. I didn't care anymore. All I knew was that I didn't want to fight again. But the AI's message was clear. There would be more. There was always more. I made my way to the dormitory sector, where the AI had promised resources. My body hurt all over, and every step felt like it was going to be my last, but I kept moving. I found the dormitory sector after wandering through the ship's rusted corridors. My legs were lead, my shoulder screamed with every movement, and the taste of blood lingered in my mouth. The AI had promised resources for surviving the fight, but so far all I'd seen were broken lights and walls stained with what looked like ancient grime, and maybe something worse. I finally reached the dormitory. There were no windows, no decorations, nothing that made it feel remotely human. The place reeked of old sweat and fear, and for a moment I wondered how many had died in this room, waiting for their next match. A couple of inmates were already there, huddled in small groups, talking in hushed tones. I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the same look I felt under my skin. But there was something else in their eyes, too. Something darker. Desperation. I didn't know if I should approach them or keep to myself. My gut told me to stay the hell away, but I knew I couldn't survive this thing alone. Not with the AI watching, not with more fights on the way. I picked a corner, as far from the others as I could, and sank down onto one of the lower bunks. The mattress was thin, a ragged piece of foam, and it creaked under my weight. But it was better than the floor I'd been dragging myself across since I woke up. I leaned back, wincing at the pain in my shoulder, and stared at the ceiling. There was no way out of this. That much was clear. The AI had set the rules, and the only way to get back into cryosleep was to play its game. I couldn't stop thinking about the man I'd killed. His blood still stained my hands, dried in the cracks of my skin. I hadn't had time to clean it off. and even if I did, I wasn't sure I could ever wash the memory away. The door to the dormitory opened again, and I glanced up. A new prisoner stumbled inside, looking just as lost as I had felt when I woke up. He was tall, thin, with the kind of wiry build that made him look fragile. But his eyes were sharp, taking in everything with a quick look. He scanned the room, then spotted me in the corner. I didn't move. Didn't give him any reason to think I was a threat. He hesitated for a second, then started toward me. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. He didn't wait for a response before sinking onto the edge of the bunk next to mine. I shrugged, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in my face. "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "You just get out of a fight?" "Yeah." He nodded like he understood. "Me too, barely made it." There was something off about him, something I couldn't place, but I was too tired to care. Everyone here had blood on their hands. We were all killers now, whether we wanted to be or not. "I'm Riker," he said, offering a hand. I shook it reluctantly. "Cade," I replied. He leaned back, letting out a long sigh. "Hell of a place they've got us in, huh?" I didn't answer. It wasn't a question that needed an answer. We both knew what this place was. Hell. And the only way to survive was to keep killing. "There's a group," Riker said after a moment, his voice dropping lower. "They're planning to team up. Figure it's the only way to beat the system, you know? Strength in numbers. You interested?" I stared at him, trying to gauge if this was some kind of trick. "What's the catch?" "No catch. We just watch each other's backs, at least until the AI throws something at us we can't handle alone." I thought about it. It made sense. If we stuck together, we had a better chance of staying alive, at least for a while. But trust didn't come easy in a place like this. And alliances, they were fragile. They broke the second someone saw a chance to get ahead. Still, I didn't have much of a choice. "All right," I said. "I'm in." Over the next few days we worked together, me, Riker, and a couple of others. There was Darrow, an ex-soldier with scars across his knuckles, and a face that looked like it had been through more fights than I could count. He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. He had the kind of presence that made you feel like he knew exactly what he was doing, even if he didn't. Then there was Samara. Quiet, deadly, and always watching. She didn't trust any of us, and to be honest, I didn't blame her. She'd been awake longer than any of us. Weeks, maybe months. The AI had put her through more fights than I wanted to think about, but somehow she was still standing. I caught her watching me a few times, her eyes sharp, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man I was. We became a unit, out of necessity more than anything. Riker did most of the talking, keeping the peace, while Darrow trained us in basic combat. I was still a mess. My shoulder hadn't healed, and every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body. But we had a system now. We were careful, trying to stay one step ahead of the AI's games. For a while it seemed to work, but deep down I knew it wouldn't last. It was after our fourth fight, another win, albeit a close one, that things started to unravel. We were all back in the dormitory, licking our wounds, trying to figure out what the AI would throw at us next. Darrow was pacing, silent as usual. Samara was off in the corner, sharpening a blade she'd managed to smuggle from the arena. Riker was talking, as always, trying to keep us focused. "We need to be ready for whatever's next," Riker said, his eyes darting between us. "The AI's testing us, seeing how far we'll go. We need to stick together. That's the only way any of us get through this." Samara glanced up from her blade. "And what happens when there's only one spot in cryo-sleep left?" Riker faltered. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there." "No," she said, her voice cold. "We need to know now." The room went quiet. We all knew what she was asking, but none of us wanted to answer. Darrow stopped pacing. His eyes, dark and calculating, locked on Riker. You're asking us to trust you, but trust gets people killed here. Riker opened his mouth to argue, but I could see it, the doubt creeping in. The cracks in our alliance were starting to show. No matter how much we pretended otherwise, we all knew that only one of us was going to make it out of this alive. You saying you don't trust me? Riker's voice was sharp now, defensive. Darrow didn't flinch. I'm saying I don't trust anyone. Samara stood, sliding her blade into a sheath at her side. He's right. This alliance won't last. We're delaying the inevitable. Riker's face changed into a scowl. So what? We just kill each other now? Is that what you want? No, Samara said calmly. But we should be prepared for when it comes to that. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for my input. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to acknowledge that they were right. But they were. Look, I said, we stick together as long as we can. When the time comes, we deal with it then. No point tearing each other apart now. Riker nodded slowly, though I could see doubt in his eyes. Yeah, all right. But something had changed. The trust, thin as it was, had been broken, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. That night, the fear of waking up to a knife in my back kept me on edge. Every sound, every movement in the dark made my heart race. I could hear Darrow shifting in his bunk, Samara sharpening her blade again, Riker muttering something in his sleep. It was only a matter of time, and when it happened, I wasn't surprised. It was Darrow who snapped first. I heard the commotion before I saw it, a low grunt, a scuffle, and then the unmistakable sound of flesh meeting steel. By the time I rolled out of my bunk, it was already too late. Darrow stood over Riker's body, a bloodied knife in his hand. Samara was already up, her blade drawn, her eyes locked on Darrow. What the hell did you do? Darrow didn't answer. He just wiped the blood from his knife and turned to face us. This was going to happen. You both knew it. Samara didn't move. Her grip on the blade tightened, her knuckles turning white. What now? Darrow's eyes flicked between us, calculating, weighing his options. Now we finish this. The room was deathly silent. No one moved, but I could feel the tension building, ready to explode. There was no turning back now. Whatever fragile alliance we'd built was gone, and the only thing left was survival. I took a step back. I wasn't ready for this, not again, but there was no avoiding it. The AI had set the rules, and we were all just playing along. The next fight wasn't going to be in the arena. It was right here. Darrow took a step toward me, knife still dripping with Riker's blood. His expression was stone, cold and unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. Samara stood on the opposite side of the room, her blade already out, her eyes flicking between me and Darrow, calculating. We all knew what was coming. There was no more pretending we were allies, no more talking, no more plans. This was the final game. The AI spoke again, its voice calm, indifferent as always. Combatants detected, initiating free-for-all protocol. Victory will result in cryosleep allocation. Cryosleep. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? That last bit of salvation. The final spot. The one thing that meant you'd be spared from this nightmare. At least for a while. I glanced at Riker's body, crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. He hadn't even had a chance. We'd spent so much time trying to form alliances, trying to convince ourselves we could beat the system together. But the AI didn't care about alliances. It didn't care about us. It only cared about the fight. Darrow's eyes shifted towards Samara, and I saw her tense up, her grip tightening on the hilt of her blade. She didn't trust him any more than I did, but I knew she wasn't stupid. She was fast, precise. She wouldn't make the first move, not unless she knew she could win. That left me. I was stuck in the middle, my shoulder still throbbing from the last fight. All I could do was stand there, caught between them, waiting for one of them to make the first move. Darrow didn't give me long to wait. With a grunt, he charged at me, knife raised. I stumbled backward, my hand scrambling for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing, just the hard metal of the ship's floor beneath me. He was fast, and I felt the sharp sting of his blade grazing my side as I dodged, a thin line of pain spreading across my ribs. I hit the ground hard, the floor knocking the wind out of me. Darrow didn't stop. He was already on top of me, his blade coming down, aimed straight for my throat. Instinct kicked in, and I rolled to the side, feeling the rush of air as the blade missed by inches. My mind scrambled for a solution. I needed a weapon. Something, anything. Then I remembered Riker. Before everything went to hell, Riker had hidden something under his bunk, a metal rod he'd found and stashed just in case. It was close, but getting to it wouldn't be easy, not with Darrow's blade slashing through the air inches from my head. Samara moved then, silent and fast, like a shadow. Her blade gleamed in the dull light as she closed the distance between her and Darrow, swinging it in a wide arc. Darrow managed to dodge, stumbling back just as her blade whistled through the air where his neck had been. Samara was quick, quicker than I'd ever seen her move. Her face was set as she pressed the attack. Darrow shifted his focus to her, snarling as he attacked. Their blades clashed, the sharp sound of steel against steel ringing out through the cramped dormitory. I pushed myself up, clutching my side, trying to catch my breath as I watched them fight. Darrow had the strength, raw power behind every swing, but Samara was faster, more agile. She ducked and weaved, her blade moving in sharp, precise arcs, going for his throat, his legs, anywhere that would give her an opening. But Darrow was a fighter, and he wasn't going down easily. He blocked her attacks, his knife flashing as he parried her strikes. He wasn't trying to outthink her, he was trying to overpower her. While they were locked in combat, this was my chance to make a move. Riker's bunk was just a few feet away. I crawled toward it, inch by agonizing inch. The pain in my side was sharp, searing with each movement, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't make it through this without a weapon. Darrow and Samara were still locked in combat. Darrow grunted, swinging wildly, but Samara was too quick, dodging his attacks and moving in for a counterstrike. She slashed across his arm, drawing a deep line of red, but he didn't slow down. If anything, the pain seemed to fuel him. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it violently. I heard the sickening pop of bone, and Samara let out a sharp cry, her blade slipping from her grasp. That was it. Samara was finished, and Darrow knew it. He turned towards her, his knife flashing toward her throat, ready to finish her. I reached out quickly, my hand closing around the solid surface of the metal rod. Without thinking, I threw myself at Darrow. The rod connected with the side of his head with a sharp crack. He let out a grunt of pain, stumbling forward, but he didn't go down. Not yet. I swung again, harder this time, putting every ounce of strength I had left into the blow. Darrow turned just in time, catching the rod with his arm, but the force was enough to send him staggering back, off balance. Samara didn't waste the opportunity. With her good hand, she snatched up her fallen blade and drove it into Darrow's side, twisting it with a savage jerk. His eyes went wide, his breath leaving his lungs in a harsh gasp. Blood spilled from his mouth as he staggered back, clutching the wound. I thought it was over. Darrow was finished. But then, with a final effort, he jumped at Samara. His knife flashed once, twice, too fast for her to dodge in her weakened state. She inhaled sharply, stumbling back and gripping her abdomen. I saw the blood spreading across her hands, dark and thick. She collapsed to her knees, her eyes wide with shock, before falling to the floor with a dull thud. Darrow stood there, breathing heavily, his hand still gripping the knife in his side. He turned to face me, blood streaming down his face, his eyes wild with pain and fury. I gripped the metal rod tighter. This was it, the final moment. One of us wasn't walking out of here alive. He charged, and I swung the rod as hard as I could, aiming for his head. The metal connected with a solid thud, and this time Darrow went down, hard. His body hit the floor and he lay there, motionless. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were unsteady, my whole body racked with exhaustion and adrenaline. I stared at him, waiting for him to get back up, waiting for him to come at me again. But he didn't. Slowly, I let the rod slip from my hands, the clatter of metal against the floor ringing in my ears. I stumbled back, collapsing onto the bunk behind me. All I could do was sit there, staring at the bodies around me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The AI's voice came through the speakers. Combatant 08467 victorious. Prepare for cryo-sleep allocation. I stared blankly at the ceiling, my mind numb. Victory. The word didn't mean anything anymore. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything. The door opened, and 3 drones floated into the cell, their mechanical arms reaching for the bodies of Darrow, Samara, and Riker. They didn't even glance at me as they picked up the bodies, dragging them out of the room, leaving a trail of blood behind. I sat there, my hands still shaking, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The AI's voice replayed in my mind, but it was distant now, like it was happening to someone else. Cryo-sleep. That's what I'd been fighting for, wasn't it? A chance to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. Not really. I was the last one standing, but it didn't feel like winning. The door to the cryo-sleep was open, waiting for me. I stepped over the bloodstains and made my way down the corridor. I don't remember going into cryo-sleep. Not really. Everything was a blur by then. The pain, the blood, the exhaustion all mixing together into something that dulled my mind. When the lid of the pod closed over me, I felt the cold rush in, numbing me. For a moment, I thought I wouldn't wake up again. Maybe that was for the best. But of course, I did. The first thing I heard was shouting. Sharp voices, barking orders, muffled through the fog of cryosleep still clinging to my mind. I was too groggy to make sense of it at first. My limbs heavy, my thoughts sluggish. My body felt like it was made of lead, every movement slow, painful. The lid of the cryopod was wide open. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand where I was. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't alone. People moved around, dark shapes in black and grey armor, their faces hidden behind helmets. Soldiers. They were swarming the ship, waking prisoners from their pods, dragging them out into the main corridor. I saw some of them checking the systems, others standing guard, weapons in hand. For a second, I thought I was still dreaming, but the reality of it hit me hard. This wasn't a dream. This was real. Before I could make sense of anything, 2 soldiers grabbed me, yanking me out of the pod. Their grips were firm but not brutal, their faces expressionless behind their helmets. I didn't resist. I didn't have the strength for it, even if I'd wanted to. My arms were pulled behind my back, zip-tied together, and I was pushed into line with a group of other prisoners, most of them still groggy, muttering to themselves, trying to understand what was happening. They led us down the corridors of the Red Womb, the ship I'd been trapped on for God knows how long. Everything looked different now, brighter, cleaner. The red emergency lights were gone, replaced by the harsh glare of floodlights set up by the soldiers. The familiar noise of the ship's failing systems had been replaced with the sound of boots marching in unison, of orders being shouted, of people being pulled out of cryosleep. The AI wasn't speaking anymore. It was gone, silenced. Eventually, they brought us to what had once been the ship's control room, but it had been transformed. Now, it was a command center. Military technicians worked at the consoles, running diagnostics, scanning the ship's systems. Officers huddled around holographic displays, speaking in low voices. Prisoners were lined up in groups, questioned, processed. They sat me down in front of a desk where a man in a dark military uniform waited. His name tag read Harlan, Captain, by the looks of him. He didn't look at me right away, just scribbled something on a tablet before finally meeting my eyes. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt raw, my body weak. The words were stuck somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Captain Harlan didn't seem to need an answer. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose like this was just another problem he had to clean up. Another mess. Here's the situation. This ship was supposed to deliver prisoners like you to a designated penal colony, but something went wrong with the AI. We lost contact with the ship, and it went off course. The AI malfunctioned. Instead of maintaining order, it created, well, what you've been living through. He paused, watching my face, but I didn't react. It didn't seem real. None of it did. We found the ship drifting in deep space. Harlan continued, his voice now touched by a kind of resigned frustration. Took us a while to track it down. The AI was running its own survival games, forcing you to fight each other, killing off prisoners one by one. That wasn't supposed to happen. Harlan let the silence hang for a moment before he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes on me. Here's the deal. Because of what you went through, your sentence is considered served. The higher-ups don't want to deal with the public fallout from this situation. So if you agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement, your record gets wiped, and you walk free. I blinked, trying to process his words. Free. He was offering me freedom. I wouldn't be going to a penal colony, no more fights, no more blood. I could leave all of this behind. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. If you don't sign, Harlan continued, his tone matter-of-fact, you'll be shipped off to one of the outer mining planets. Lifetime labor, no parole, no appeals. You work until you die. So, I suggest you take the deal. The choice was simple, really. Sign the NDA and bury everything that had happened on this ship. Or refuse, and spend the rest of my life breaking rocks in the middle of nowhere. They didn't want people knowing about the Red Womb. They wanted to erase it, pretend like it had never happened. How could I just agree to forget everything I'd been through? The people I'd killed? But I knew, deep down, there was no real choice. I'd done enough surviving for a lifetime. I wasn't going to throw away the only chance I had at getting out. I'll sign, I said. Harlan nodded, sliding the tablet across the desk. Good choice. When I finished, they untied me. I was handed a set of basic civilian clothes, nothing special, just enough to blend in, and led off the ship. The air felt fresh outside. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd felt real air. I breathed in deeply, letting it fill my lungs, but it didn't bring the relief I thought it would. I was free, but I didn't feel free. The bar was small, tucked away in the corner of some spaceport city on a planet I didn't even know the name of. I sat alone at a table in the back, staring into the bottom of my glass. The alcohol burned going down, but it didn't dull the memories. It didn't make the nightmares go away. Around me, people were talking, laughing, living their lives, normal lives. They had no idea what I'd been through, what I'd done, and they never would. I'd signed away that part of me. I'd survived the Red Womb. I was alive, but I wasn't sure if I could call this living. I glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at my drink. The bar was quiet, save for the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. It was a far cry from the chaos of the ship, from the constant noise, the blood, the fear. But somehow I still felt trapped. Like a part of me was still back there in the halls of that ship, fighting to survive. I finished my drink and set the glass down, staring into the empty space in front of me. The world around me kept moving, but I stayed still, frozen. Maybe I'd never really escaped.